Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've lived with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, POTS, for about 5 years now. For those who don't know, it's a condition that causes my heart rate to skyrocket when I stand up, which can lead to dizziness, fainting, and a whole host of other symptoms. After passing out at work one too many times, my doctor insisted I start using a wheelchair for my own safety. It was a hard adjustment, but it beats hitting my head on the floor every other day. My apartment complex isn't the fanciest place in town, but it's affordable and has decent wheelchair accessibility. When people respect the rules, that is. For months, I've been dealing with this one tenant who seemed to think the fire lane and sidewalk directly in front of my apartment was her personal parking spot. I'd mentioned it to my landlord casually, thinking he'd handle it, but all he did was ask me to document it by taking photos whenever it happened. This all came to a head back in January. I had just gotten home from an exhausting shift at work. When I pulled into the parking lot, I immediately spotted her car, parked right under the no parking fire lane sign and blocking half the sidewalk. I couldn't get my wheelchair through without risking tipping over. With a heavy sigh, I left my wheelchair in my car and carefully made my way to her car to take pictures for my landlord. My legs were shaky, but I managed to stay upright while snapping a few photos. That's when I heard the screaming. The woman stormed toward me from her ground floor apartment, demanding to know what I was doing and if I was taking pictures of her car. She was wearing pajama pants despite it being mid-afternoon and looked absolutely furious. I explained that her car was blocking the sidewalk and parked in a fire lane and that I needed to document this for the landlord. She angrily told me to mind my own business and insisted there was plenty of space for me to walk around. I told her that I use a wheelchair and couldn't get through when she parked like that, explaining that this happens almost every day. She dismissively said it wasn't her problem and ordered me to delete the pictures right away. I decided it wasn't worth arguing and started to walk toward my apartment, ignoring her demands. That's when things got ugly. She stepped directly in front of me, blocking my path. She repeated her demand for me to delete the pictures, this time screaming so close to my face that I could feel her spit hitting my cheeks. I felt the familiar lightheadedness starting. By reflex, I put my hands up and shoved her back to create some space. I didn't push hard, just enough to get her out of my personal space. She reacted with shock and rage, saying I had no right to put my hands on her. Before I could react, she lunged forward, wrapped her hand around my throat, and started punching me with her other hand. I couldn't breathe. The acrylic nails on the hand around my throat dug into my skin. I felt warm blood running down my neck as I tried to break free. Thankfully, my roommate and a couple neighbors had been smoking on the balcony and saw what was happening. They came running down the stairs. My roommate shouted at her to get off me, while the neighbor yelled for her to stop and let go. It took all three of them to pull her off me. As soon as they did, the room started spinning, and I felt myself going down. The last thing I remember was someone calling 911. I woke up to paramedics hovering over me. My neck was throbbing, and they were putting pressure on it to stop the bleeding from the cuts her nails had made. They wanted to take me to the ER, and after a syncope episode right in front of them, I didn't argue. At the hospital, while getting stitches in my neck, I decided to press charges. I figured she'd get aggravated assault or something similar. What I didn't expect was how quickly everything would spiral for her. When the police went to arrest her, they made sure to catch her at home. I had mentioned to the officers that I'd seen a gun mounted on her wall during a building fire alarm evacuation a few months back. I remembered thinking it was odd, since I'd overheard the landlord mentioning she had a felony record. The police found way more than just a gun. The car she'd been so defensive about, stolen, no insurance or license either. Inside her apartment, they discovered used needles scattered everywhere, with her 8-year-old child present. The gun on the wall was also reported stolen. I found all this out 2 days ago when the district attorney called with an update. The woman's child had apparently recorded the entire assault on a phone at her mother's instruction, thinking it would somehow prove I was harassing her. Instead, it provided perfect evidence of the assault, which, combined with her 7 previous assault charges in the past 5 years, sealed her fate. The district attorney explained that if they had only arrested her outside her home, she would have likely just gotten probation because she's a parent. But catching her with the stolen items, illegal firearm, and drugs meant she lost everything: her child, now in foster care, her apartment, the stolen car, and her freedom. She is facing at least 30 years in prison once all the state charges for the drugs and weapons are added up. I didn't set out to ruin someone's life. I just wanted to get into my apartment without having to abandon my wheelchair. That's all really, but oh well. I've been a groundskeeper at Oak Ridge Community Park for almost 8 years now. It's a decent job. I maintain the gardens, empty trash cans, and make sure the equipment is safe for the kids. Most people are friendly, but there's always that one person who thinks rules don't apply to them. Last month, I was doing my usual morning rounds when I noticed someone had set up what looked like a mini office under the big oak tree in the central lawn area. There was a folding table, a laptop, papers spread everywhere, and a woman in her 40s typing furiously. Not exactly against the rules, but unusual. I decided to keep an eye on the situation. As the morning went on, I noticed fewer kids were playing in that area. When I walked by to check, I heard the woman harshly ordering a young boy to get away from her area. She was yelling at him that she was working on something important and that he should go play somewhere else. The poor kid looked terrified and ran back to his parents. I approached her calmly. I politely asked her if everything was okay and reminded her that this was a public area of the park. She responded angrily, saying she needed absolute quiet for her work. She declared that she had claimed this spot and no one should come within 20 feet of her. She added that she had been coming here for weeks, and this was now her spot. I apologized but explained that's not how public parks work, telling her everyone has equal right to use this space. She then started bragging about how much she pays in taxes, more than most people in the neighborhood combined, which in her mind made this her park. She then told me to leave her alone. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who said to monitor the situation but not escalate unless necessary. The next day, she was back with an even larger setup, including privacy screens. Parents started complaining that she was being aggressive toward their children, but we couldn't do much besides ask her to be respectful. Things changed drastically 3 days later. I arrived early to find her setting up something different. She was crouched in the bushes surrounding her area, placing what looked like small metal devices in the grass and covering them with leaves. I asked her what she was doing. She dismissed my concern, stating it was nothing that concerned me and that she was just securing her workspace. Something felt very wrong. I pretended to walk away but circled back and watched from behind a maintenance shed. She was placing what I now recognized as small bear traps around the perimeter of her office space. My blood ran cold. I immediately called the police and my supervisor then started trying to warn people to stay away from the area. Most parents understood the urgency in my voice and kept their kids on the playground side of the park. But one young boy, maybe 7 or 8, was chasing a ball that was rolling straight toward one of the hidden traps. I shouted for the boy to stop and not go there. I sprinted across the lawn and managed to grab him just before he stepped on the trap. The boy's father came running over, confused and alarmed. The father demanded to know what was going on and why I was grabbing his son. I pointed to the ground where I could see the edge of the metal trap peeking out from under some leaves. I explained that the woman had set bear traps around her workspace and that his son had almost stepped on one. The father's face went from confusion to horror to rage in seconds. Other parents gathered around as I pointed out more traps. Someone must have told the woman what was happening because suddenly she was storming toward us. She yelled at us not to touch the traps, saying they were protecting her area. She justified herself by saying they were there because none of us could control our children. The boy's father asked incredulously if she was insane, telling her his son could have lost his leg. She retorted that the boy should learn to stay away from private property. By now, everyone was shouting. Parents were frantically checking for more traps while keeping their children away. The woman stood defiantly, insisting she had every right to protect her workspace from invaders. When she tried to physically block a parent from removing one of the traps, chaos erupted. Thankfully, that's when police sirens cut through the noise. Two police cars pulled up, and officers approached the scene. The woman immediately started telling her version of events. She complained to the officers that people wouldn't respect her private workspace in the park. She claimed she'd been coming here for weeks, and it was established as her area now. She added that she had to protect it because park management wouldn't help her. One officer asked her directly if she had placed bear traps in a public park. She defended herself by saying they were just deterrents and that she had important work to do, while these people let their brats run wild. One officer spoke to witnesses while another examined the traps. I showed them the ones I'd found and explained the situation. The woman became increasingly agitated as she realized people weren't taking her side. She started protesting that this was ridiculous. She again mentioned how she pays for the park with her taxes, which in her mind made this partially her property. The officer told her that she had placed dangerous traps in a public space where children play, and that was a serious offense. She tried to gather her belongings and leave, but the officers blocked her path. When they told her she was being detained, she completely lost it. She knocked over her table, scattering papers everywhere, and tried to run. One officer caught her arm, but she swung her laptop bag at him. It took both officers to finally handcuff her while she screamed about her rights and how important her work was. As they led her to the police car, she spotted me and yelled out threats. She blamed me for everything, threatening to sue me and the entire park. She shouted that I would never work again when she was done with me. The officer reminded her of her right to remain silent and suggested she use it. We later found out she'd placed 12 bear traps in total. 12. The police removed them all, and the park was closed for a thorough safety inspection. When they searched her belongings, they found receipts for the traps and a journal where she'd written about securing her territory and teaching those brats a lesson. She was charged with multiple offenses including reckless endangerment, attempted assault, and resisting arrest. The judge denied bail after prosecutors argued she was a danger to the community. The important project she kept talking about turned out she was writing a self-help book called Taking What's Yours: How to Claim Your Space in a Crowded World. The park reopened a week later. We held a community picnic to reclaim the space, and the mayor even came to thank me for preventing what could have been a tragedy. The oak tree area is now more popular than ever with families. Sometimes I think about sending her a picture of all the kids happily playing in her spot, but I figure prison mail might not allow it. I've always been a bit of an odd duck in my prairie neighborhood. Living in the Midwest has its perks: friendly folks, wide open spaces, and a sense of community that's hard to find elsewhere. But what most people don't realize when they first meet me is that beneath my regular appearance lies someone who grew up as a country girl, practically glued to my dad's side. Dad never believed in gender-specific chores. Tools don't care who's holding them, he'd say, teaching me everything from fixing tractors to wielding chainsaws. Those lessons faded into the background of my adult life until summer 2024, when Mother Nature decided to remind us all who's really in charge. The storms that summer were biblical: tornadoes ripping through neighborhoods and straight-line winds that sounded like freight trains. One storm in particular had us all huddled in our basement listening to what sounded like the apocalypse above us. When we finally emerged, our house had miraculously survived with minimal damage, but our neighborhood looked like a war zone. Trees down everywhere, blocking roads, crushing cars, and punching holes through roofs. My husband looked at me and said what I was already thinking. He told me we needed a chainsaw. Getting to any store meant an adventure in itself. We took our SUV, going off-road through fields and around downed trees just to reach a passable road. 2 hours later, we returned with a shiny new gas-powered chainsaw. I hadn't handled one in years, but some skills never really leave you. Still, setting up a new one was different from using my dad's old, reliable model. I walked up to my neighbor's house, where he was already clearing debris. I asked him if he could help me get the chainsaw started, explaining that it had been a while since I'd used one. He cheerfully agreed and told me he would show me the basics for this particular model. He walked me through the primer, the choke, and the safety features. Within minutes, I was back in business, the familiar weight of the saw comfortable in my hands. The neighborhood became a hub of activity, everyone outside working together, clearing branches and cutting up fallen trees. It felt good to be useful, to be part of something bigger than myself. After our immediate area was manageable, I posted on Facebook. I wrote that I had finished with our cleanup and asked if anyone needed help, mentioning that I had a chainsaw and wasn't afraid to use it. A friend quickly responded that she could use the help, so I packed up my new tree-chewing love along with safety gear and headed over. When I arrived, her yard looked like a timber yard had exploded. Several people were already working, and I counted 4 chainsaws in use. I set my equipment down on her deck and turned to help a couple struggling with a heavy branch. That's when I noticed him. A guy I'd never met before who had spotted my unattended chainsaw and decided it was community property. He was pressing buttons and flipping switches at random, looking increasingly frustrated. I tried to politely interrupt him, but only managed to say, "Excuse me, but," before he cut me off. He launched into a condescending explanation about how to operate the chainsaw, telling me I needed to flip certain switches and pull the chain in a specific way. He added that the chainsaw wasn't starting and warned me that I needed to be really careful with such equipment. His tone made it clear he assumed I knew nothing about chainsaws. I politely told him that the chainsaw was actually mine. I explained that he needed to release the lock and prime it before it would start, and offered to demonstrate. I took the saw from his hands, released the safety, primed the engine, and pulled the cord once. The machine roared to life immediately. I gave it a few revs before shutting it down and offering it back to him, asking if he wanted to try starting it himself. That's when I finally looked at his face. His expression was priceless, like he'd just seen a unicorn doing calculus. He could only stammer out a confused sound. I told him that if he could safely start it, I wouldn't mind him using it. I explained that there were many jobs that needed doing, so I was going back to the task I had been working on before. I set the chainsaw down, engaged the safety lock, and returned to helping with branch removal. From the corner of my eye, I watched him back away slowly, as if I might suddenly challenge him to a lumberjack competition. For the rest of the day, he made sure to stay on the opposite side of the yard from me, occasionally looking over with that same bewildered expression. Later that afternoon, I overheard a conversation. Another person asked the man if he could help cut a section, and the man actually suggested they ask me instead, awkwardly adding that I was really good with chainsaws. My friend caught my eye and grinned. She commented that I had probably broken the man's brain a little. I replied that it was good, and maybe his brain would reboot with a better operating system. We spent the rest of the day clearing debris, cutting up fallen trees, and helping her neighbors too. By sunset, the area looked significantly better, and I'd run through 2 tanks of gas in my chainsaw. As I packed up to leave, the man who'd tried to commandeer my equipment earlier approached cautiously. He complimented my skills and apologized for his earlier behavior. I nodded, accepting his awkward apology, and told him it wasn't a problem, adding that we all learned something today. He reflected that the lesson was about not judging a book by its cover. I agreed, but added that he had also learned how to properly start a chainsaw. He left at that, finally relaxing a bit. We ended up exchanging tips about yard maintenance as I loaded my car. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.